Welcome to MacGyver's Workshop, where you never know what we're going to be working on next. If you're not too careful, you just might learn something.
Now I've got my drain, my roll around drain thing here. We'll go ahead and get these bolts out of here and pop this cover loose and let the gear oil drain out. Just a little trivia for you. I told you earlier that this is a GM 10 bolt rear end, and what that means is it has 10 bolts holding the back cover on. And you may have heard back in the old days in the 60s and 70s, you'd hear somebody talking about a 12 volt posi, and that rear end was a little bigger and beefier than this one, and it had 12 bolts holding the back cover on. So now let's get all these off of here. And we're going to kind of have to work around our brake lines here, but that's okay. And here we go. Very gently pry this cover loose here. It's popped loose at the top, but it's stuck real good at the bottom. So, well, there's your welcome to Tennessee. Dirt daubers everywhere. I figured they'd build a nest in a gnat's behind if they figure out a way to do it. And you don't want to just pop this thing all off at once, because you got almost like 2 quarts of fluid in here, so you don't want it come sailing out of there all at once on you. There we go. This gear oil, nasty, stinky stuff. There's this little bolt right here that holds this pin in. So we have to take this bolt out, and then this pin will slide out. And I'll rotate this around and show you what we got here. Okay. And right inside there is where the axle comes in, and there's a little C-clip recessed in there. Okay, now this pin being in here keeps that C-clip captive in this pinion here. So once we drop that pin out, we can push this axle in a little bit and pop that C-clip out. Let's roll this around here, and we can get to this bolt here. It's got a 5/16 head on it, and they can be a challenge because they're usually in there pretty doggone tight. So now the tricky bit is that I've got this transmission in neutral here, so it's going to want to turn the ring and pinion. So I can try and hold it. There we go. There we go. That wasn't too bad. I've seen them a lot worse, where I mean, you really had to work at it to get that pin out of there. The good thing is this ring gear, I mean, it looks pretty decent. I'm not seeing any, horrific looking damage, no busted teeth or anything like that. Now what we do before we pull our pin out here is we roll this down just enough where we can get this pin out, and then we can push this center pin down here and roll this down as much as we can, like so. And I like to put everything back exactly the way it were. So I got my pin in the way it would be in the differential here. So, and we'll lay this aside. Of course, I'm gonna have to walk across the front of the camera here, but, and you press in on the hub, okay, just a little bit, and you heard that little tink. That was the C-clip falling out. And sometimes it's better to get a magnet. There we go. And one C-clip. And that's why they call it a C-clip, because it looks like a letter C. Now, we can slide our axle out. All right. And out she comes. And here's your axle shaft. Now what you want to do is you want to look at the surface of the axle right here where I'm pointing with my, wiggling with my thumb, and make sure it's not gouged or, you know, grooved or anything. And this one's in good shape. So we'll get our that repair bearing will be just what the doctor ordered, because it'll offset that seal just a bit so it rides on a different surface, and that way we're guaranteed not to have any leaks when we go back together with it. So now we're ready to disassemble our brake shoes and all that stuff off the backing plate, and we're ready to pull this bearing out. Now, one thing that I did neglect to mention earlier in the list of tools that we're going to use for this job, a couple things that I didn't mention was a slide hammer. Okay, and I have a bearing puller set, and there's all different, you know, this little kit from Harbor Freight, it's cheap, and as you can tell, it's like really cheap because I broke one. And if you look at it, you can tell that's pot metal. So not the greatest thing in the world, but you know, you can spend a little more money and get a better one and you'd be fine, which is what I'll eventually do. But you know, it's probably been a year and a half or 2 years since I've actually had cause to use one of these. But basically it looks like this, and what you do, you run this little nut back, slide this washer back, and then you just fold this over and push it through the bearing, and you see how it falls down, and then it comes back, all right, like that. And what you do, just to make sure you don't slip and go yanking your slide hammer and yourself across the room, you run this big washer down on this nut, okay, and it locks it in place, makes it nice and sturdy, and you screw your slide hammer in here and give her a couple of whacks, and it'll pull that bearing and the seal out all at the same time. We'll go ahead and yank this bearing out. I've already got the one in here installed already. And one thing that's important when you're using one of these slide hammers, you want to make sure you screw your slide hammer in there about as far as you can go, because threads equal strength. So the more threads you can get into your device there, the stronger it'll be. You know, you just stick a few threads in there and yank on this thing. This thing puts a hell of a lot of force on that, and it'll pull those threads right out. There, see it stopped. Now, if you want, you can You could always run your nut down there and lock it in place, but no real need. So let's give her a couple of whacks here. All right, there we go. One bearing, one seal. And as they say, booyah. Now you use your spring release tool here and go for the first spring on the top. That pops it out. Now, if you're bad about putting puzzles together and you can't remember where stuff goes, you know, take a picture with your phone, all right? And what I do is I lay it down as in the orientation that it is on the vehicle. So that way I remember where everything goes. Now, of course, I've probably done 1,000 brake jobs, you know, on a GM, so I could do this with my eyes closed, but for the sake of the video, I'm going to show you. So, you know, you got this spring this way, this spring this way, and the other thing you always got to remember when it comes to drum brakes, okay, always remember biggie shoe to the back. All right, as you'll notice, and I'll show you when I go to put the new shoes on here later, one shoe has more material on it than the other. So the one with the more radius always goes to the back. So, and then, you know, it can get a little tricky too with the self-adjusters here and all these little mechanisms and linkages and bits and bobs. So, you know, it's kind of important to, you know, remember where all this stuff goes. Now what I'll do here is I'll go ahead and I'll reposition the camera a little bit, give you a better view of what I'm working on here. Yeah, that's better. Now you can see what I'm working on here. So now after I've taken these two springs out and laid them down on my little work surface here, and we'll take our little self-adjusting lever and arm off of here. Okay, and we'll put that there where it goes. Then you got a whole bunch of stuff here, but you're best off to start from the front here, the unladen side as we call it. Take that out, put that there, and we got one more little spring down here with our little star wheel adjuster thingy, and we got our little bias bar or whatever you want to call that here. That's for the, like a strut for the parking brake. And what you can do is you can just roll this over like that, and all this stuff just falls apart easy as you please and comes out of there. And there we go. Somewhere, where's my little pin? There it is. There we go. And you kind of want to hang on to it, because a whole bunch of stuff's going to fall out at once on you. All right. Now what you got here, you got your self-adjusting arm, and notice I'm holding on to this spring here with the palm here, so that stays where it goes. And then you have your parking brake lever right here, and it goes up through a pin, okay, and has like a, sometimes they'll have like a horseshoe clip. This one has like a little E-clip on it. Now we'll pop our little E-clip out of here. Sometimes you can get away with using a screwdriver. I kind of like using a pick. But you do want to be careful, because not all your brake shoes your replacement brake shoes come with this stuff. So don't want to lose it. You can see that's a tiny little E-clip right there. And that just pulls out of the brake shoe there, and that just hangs there. Now what I'm going to do, oh yeah, you got this little guy, you got to come off of there too. And you can pull these little guys out if you want, but I'm just going to leave them in there. Looks like these wheel cylinders have been replaced at some point in the truck's life. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get my parts cleaner and bring it over here and swap it out with my little table thing here. We'll lower the truck down a little bit. We'll wash this backing plate off and get it cleaned up. I have a regular little roll around parts washer. You could have a little low profile pan or something with some mineral spirits in it or parts cleaner or whatever. And as long as you got a good parts cleaning brush, you can dip it in there and get it up here and kind of wash it off and all that. But one thing I'm going to do though is, we don't want the parts cleaner getting inside here and potentially diluting our gear oil later on. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to kind of wad up a shop towel here and just kind of shove that in there and just kind of make sure that we don't accidentally shoot any stuff in there. And then what I'll do, I just got me a little container here that fills up with the parts cleaner, and you just kind of go like so and just get rid of all that gear oil, and it's kind of like some kind of spooge. Well, when the gear oil mixes with the brake dust from the brake linings and such, and it can get pretty nasty. And especially this one's really not that bad. I've seen them to where this whole thing is just totally wet, soaked, and gear oil dripping out of the bottom of the brake drum and getting all over the tire, and they can get pretty bad. So, like I said, this one's not terrible, but we'll get it nice and cleaned up and get our pop our new bearing and seal in there, and then we'll get it all back together. So let me get this all cleaned up and I'll be back in a minute. The thing about a parts cleaner is the fluid most likely will be some kind of oil-based mineral spirits or something like that. So this will never dry. So that's where it's handy. Have you some like brake clean, spray brake clean, and then you can just kind of wet it down. All right, and then maybe use your brush, to get any residual spooge out of there. But the main thing you want to do is you want to dry up all that gear oil and get it out of there. And your parts cleaner will do that. It'll cut that oil and get it out of there. And then you just run it over it with your brake cleaner, and that'll dry the parts cleaner off of there, the fluid. And then you blow it dry with some compressed air. your backing plate will be nice and dry. And if you got any remaining little wet spots there or whatever, no big deal. Just hit it with some more brake clean. And it's dry. Okay. And pull your shop rag out of there and don't leave it in there. And then what I like to do is kind of wipe this whole area out here. Get that nice and clean, and we'll be ready to pop our new bearing back in here. So now we're ready to put our repair bearing in here. Now there's a little tiny rubber O-ring on here. So what I like to do is I like to get me a little finger full of gear oil and lube this whole slot up where this thing's going to seat into, and then rub me a little bit of that gear oil on this O-ring so it slides on in there nice and easy as you please. And then we set that in there like so. Okay. Then I use a bearing race and seal driver. Really inexpensive at Harbor Freight. Even more so inexpensive if you catch them on sale. And then what I like to do is just kind of get it half started here, and then we just drive it on in. And you'll know when you hit bottom, because you'll tell it'll feel different. But see how that sounds different? So there she goes. There's a little lip inside there that seats against. Now I'm going to wash up my brake hardware, my springs and adjuster and all that, and get all the grease spooge off of them. And heck, since I got the axle out, it's easier to it's twice as easy to hang the brakes on there without that axle flange in the way. So we'll do that. It'd be easy peasy. So we got our new brake shoes here, and you can tell now a lot easier since they're clean and they don't have spooge all over them. You can tell this brake shoe has a lot more lining on it than this one does. So it's always important to remember that the big shoe always goes to the back. Now we can start going back together with it in the reverse of disassembly. And we'll start by putting our parking brake lever back on here. And we'll put our little E-clip back on here. All right. I like to do is take you a little tiny bit of brake grease here, and just a dab will do you. You don't need a lot. And you want to put just a little bit on all these little pads right here, and that's where the shoes slide back and forth. And what this is brake caliper grease, and it's a super high temperature grease that won't like melt and run everywhere. And you just put just a little tiny little dab on there, and that just makes it so the brake shoes don't you know, squeak or anything when you apply the brakes. Just a good thing to do. All right, now where was I? We're gonna put this in here. And here's where it kind of helps to have like 8 hands, because what you're gonna do, you gotta put your self-adjuster arm in here. Get that in there like so. Then the retainer, this is always fun. And you gotta slot it into its little keyhole there. There we go. That one's the most challenging one there, because you've got so much stuff on there. You really have to clamp that, push that spring down really tight. And we'll put our thingy in there. And you do want your star wheel to be kind of lubricated a little bit so that it works freely. And if it seems like it's stuck or stiff, then take it over to the vise and fix it. You know, get it broke loose and then lube it up. All right, so now we got that all nice and lubed up real good. Remember, the wheel always goes to where the little arm is. And then your brake shoe and your spring, you want the long part over going this way, because it has to reach over that star wheel. So, and you kind of got to again have a couple 3 hands here. Get your pin in there, then get your star wheel in there. Then you kind of got to stretch this out to get it on that adjuster. There, like that. Then, using your 4th, 5th, and 6th hand, line up your parking brake strut and your wheel cylinder pin. Get her on there. And then put this retainer on. Now this one tends to go on a little bit easier than the other one, because it doesn't have as much tension on it. And you kind of have to look through there to see where your pin is. Hey, now that's going to pretty much help hold everything in place here. Then what we do, we put our little keystone up here. And there we go. From here, this goes on next. Whichever way suits you to get it on there. It's all good. Then we put this spring on. And for that, you use the opposite end of your little springy tool here and just run her up like that, and bada bing, bada boom. And she is in there. And then this one goes in like so. Comes up and hooks onto this. There you go. Brake shoes are done and back on there. She's all ready to rock and roll. Now, we'll put our axle shaft back in there. Very gently insert our axle shaft in here, being careful and try not to damage any of the seals. And I should have mentioned previously, this repair bearing comes pre-lubed, so it's got some lubricant on there, so you don't have to worry about like gobbing it up with anything before you go back and reassemble it. So, and what I will do now that we got it clean is I will wipe a little gear oil on the bearing and sealing surface here, and then we will get our bearing, our axle shaft back in here, and we might have to rotate it around a little bit to make sure everything lines up. We got all our little splines in there. Give us just a little persuasion tap here. And shove it all the way back in there so we can seat our C-clip, and then we'll push it back out to lock the C-clip in, and we'll put our pin and everything back in, and then we can reseal that back cover. We can put our C-clip back in here and then push the axle back out so that it will hold that C-clip in there while we push our pin back up through there. Get our pin up through here. There's a helpful little tip here. If you're not sure what your rear end gear ratio is, you can always take and count the teeth on the ring gear, make a note of how many teeth, and then make a note of how many teeth are on the pinion, and divide the number of teeth on the ring gear by the number of teeth on the pinion, and that gives you your rear axle ratio. That's a helpful little techie tip there. Now, most of the time, the rear axle will have a lot of tag on it, but not always. All right, run this thing down here. And I'll put our brake line back in place here. Always want to make sure you remember to fill the differential when you're working on one of these things. You basically fill it up until it runs out the fill hole here. And that way you know you got your correct level of gear oil in there. And we'll put our plug back in here, screw that down nice and tight, and then clean off our excess. We'll snug this plug down nice and snuggy. That's one and done there. All right, now we are ready to bleed some brakes here. And always want to start the furthest from the master cylinder.